Picture the idyllic silence of an August evening in 1982, deep within the scenic Gambrels State Park in Frederick, Maryland. This park is nestled within the Catoctin Mountains, a rugged, isolated expanse known for its natural beauty, and, less appealingly, as a conveniently remote area for body disposal. On this particular evening, a couple out mushroom hunting stumbled upon something chilling: a heavy, antiquated steamer trunk sitting just a few feet off a secluded gravel roadway. Curiosity, perhaps mixed with dread, compelled them to pry it open with a rock, as was the style at the time. The mushroom foraging couple got the shock of their lives when they found the decomposed, skeletal remains of a woman inside. This woman would eventually be given an unusual nickname that has made her stick out amongst dough cases. She was dubbed the cheerleader in the trunk. But before we get into the theory that led to that name, I've got to discuss the foundational details of the case. The body had been carefully placed within the trunk, a cumbersome piece of luggage that would have required considerable effort and planning to obtain, load, and transport. Yet, despite this premeditation, the final act of disposal seemed hasty. The trunk was only lightly covered with scattered leaves and sticks, and remained clearly visible just off the road. This is despite the fact that this is an area where the perpetrator could have tossed the trunk somewhere where it likely never would have been found. This suggests that whoever was dropping off this trunk may have thought he had been spotted and had to discard it very quickly. The very choice of Gambrels State Park for this disposal wasn't accidental. Areas like the Frederick watershed are known to locals as places where remains are occasionally dumped, minimizing the travel distance required to hide the body. This strongly indicates the killer possessed local knowledge of the area and was highly likely residing or working within the immediate area. The remains were taken to the morgue in Baltimore for forensic analysis. The victim was identified as a petite white female, believed to be in her late teens or early 20s, though initial forensic estimates had a wider range of 17 to 45 years. She stood approximately 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet 5 inches tall and was estimated to weigh between 100 and 130 pounds. Her hair was described as medium length, wavy, and dark brown, though analysis of her body hair suggested her natural color might have been reddish brown. Strikingly, no clothing or jewelry was found with the remains, stripping investigators of the conventional markers that often lead to quick identification. The only item recovered within the footlocker was a dark-colored towel. The lack of any personal effects implies that the killer meticulously controlled the crime scene, removing anything that could readily link the victim to her life or their location. Establishing the time of death became an immediate and overwhelming investigative roadblock, and seriously, this is one of the least precise estimates I've ever seen. Although initial forensic investigation determined that death likely occurred in early spring 1982, the cops brought on a forensic anthropologist for further analysis. What he said would upend this entire timeline. First, he affirmed that it was possible that she had died in 1982, a few months prior. However, based on the evidence, he couldn't exclude the possibility that she died up to 10 years earlier, as far back as 1972. This massive temporal ambiguity crippled the investigation's early efforts, making it virtually impossible to link her to a manageable list of missing persons. After all, it wasn't possible to just do a quick computer search of databases back in the day. Notably, a definitive cause of death remained somewhat elusive due to the advanced skeletal state. However, key forensic evidence pointed towards a deeply personal and aggressive attack. Fractures on the bones indicated potential forceful strangulation, requiring prolonged close contact aggression. Personally, I think this is good enough evidence to say that she most likely died from strangulation, though of course given the state of her remains, they can't say this beyond any doubt. The most compelling and perhaps paradoxical evidence lies in the Jane Doe's dental and skeletal profiles, and that skeletal profile would give her the cheerleader nickname. Her dental records were extensive, suggesting access to significant health care throughout her life. She had 2 crowns on her left front teeth, a root canal, several silver fillings, and a gold-filled tooth on the upper right side. Investigators initially felt this unique composite of dental procedures, which often leaves a distinct signature, would quickly lead to her identification. Adding a layer of complexity to this unique dental profile, examiners noted that some of the dental procedures were consistent with work performed by dental students. This is an incredibly important detail, because dental schools maintain exhaustive, meticulously detailed patient files that could potentially stretch back decades. This information suggests the victim may have received care at a university clinic, possibly due to a lower cost or as part of a dental residency program. Oddly, a stark contrast existed in her mouth. She had 2 impacted wisdom teeth that had never been removed. These teeth would have been a source of chronic pain. The fact that a woman with 2 expensive front crowns and a gold filling allowed these painful teeth to remain untreated suggests something. Perhaps she had a critical disruption in her life or a financial downturn in the years immediately preceding her death. This shift offers a narrative of likely vulnerability in her final years, which may be why she is yet to be identified. The famous nickname "cheerleader in the trunk" originated not from speculation, but from the forensic evidence inscribed on her bones. An anthropologist examining the skeleton noted distinct markers of a highly active life. The woman exhibited spondylolysis, a defect in the vertebrae, and heavy wear on her pelvis and feet. This unique pattern suggested she regularly engaged in high-impact acrobatic activities, such as dance, gymnastics, or cheerleading. According to some, this indicated she was a disciplined, possibly professional athlete or performer whose physical career may have peaked in her late teens or early 20s. The skeletal profile, therefore, provides a biographical record of her life before her death. If she was in her early to mid-20s, as currently estimated, her intense athletic career had likely ended. Alternatively, some analysts have suggested the heavy wear on her feet could also indicate the frequent use of high-heeled shoes or prolonged periods of hard physical labor. This high-heeled element suggests that she may have been a professional dancer of the more illicit variety. Regardless of the exact interpretation, her skeleton records a history of significant, sustained physical work. Despite being featured numerous times on television shows and podcasts, the case of the cheerleader in the trunk languished, unable to generate the tip needed to restore her name. The killer's motivations remain speculative, but the method of disposal provides strong circumstantial evidence regarding their profile. The offender had to be highly motivated, possessing the means to acquire and transport a large steamer trunk, and demonstrating intimate knowledge of the Frederick watershed area. The single greatest ongoing challenge is technical: the state of her remains. Past attempts to obtain a DNA profile have failed, with forensic labs citing insufficient DNA for sequencing. Without a usable DNA profile, the most powerful modern tool for cold case resolution, investigative genetic genealogy, can't be used yet. Speaking as someone who looks at these old cases all the time, this case is honestly so frustrating. This is a woman with such a detailed, specific history written right there in her teeth. It's a whole roadmap of her life. Despite that fact, no dental records have ever matched up, which seems to me to mean that she's never been reported missing. When a missing person is entered into the national database, all their vitals, including their dentals, are tossed in there. I suppose there's always the chance that her information could have been entered incorrectly, and there's another missing woman out there who just hasn't had her name attached to this case. I suspect that at this point this Jane Doe won't have her name back until forensic advances allow a complete DNA profile to be taken from her bones. When a person disappears, the investigation usually begins with retracing their steps or interviewing close contacts. But what happens when the last step taken is into a fortress-like diplomatic compound where surveillance is omnipresent and entry is highly controlled? On a routine summer day, Peter Dimitrov walked into the U.S. Embassy in Sofia for a standard visa interview and performed an impossible disappearing act. He never left the building. Peter vanished inside American territory, creating a decade-long vacuum of official information that has haunted his family. Or at least, that's been the commonly accepted narrative thus far. And as you'll see, I think the foundational assumption about this weird unsolved mystery is likely incorrect. The known facts of Peter's disappearance center on a mundane appointment scheduled for June 12, 2010. Peter Dimitrov, a 23-year-old from the town of Popovo, arrived at the sprawling United States Embassy complex in Bulgaria's capital, Sofia. Also, just as a quick aside, I think that's probably the best name possible for a capital. Sofia, Bulgaria. I love the ring of it. Kind of sounds like the name of a person when you say it together. He was accompanied by two friends who waited for him outside, confirming that they saw him enter the diplomatic premises. That entrance marks the last documented, confirmed sighting of Peter. The circumstances surrounding this vanishing are fundamentally constrained by the high-security environment of the U.S. diplomatic mission. Diplomatic compounds, particularly those in strategic NATO partner nations like Bulgaria, operate under strict protocols designed to prevent precisely this kind of unauthorized movement. When an applicant approaches the consular section for an interview, they are forced to lose contact with the outside world. Strict security policies mandate that applicants can't bring laptops, tablets, large bags, or sealed packages. Mobile phones are of course screened and held by security personnel for the duration of the meeting. Crucially, the regulations confirm that no one, not friends, spouses, nor attorneys, is allowed to accompany the applicant into the consular waiting room. This ensures the interviewee is isolated and thoroughly screened before meeting with a consular officer. This hyper-controlled environment dictates the starting point for the investigation. It's virtually unthinkable that a routine civilian could slip past multiple layers of security, bypass the consular section, and leave the highly monitored diplomatic grounds unnoticed. The moment Peter passed the initial security checkpoint, his fate became governed by the laws and diplomatic privileges of the United States. This jurisdictional shield fundamentally limits the ability of Bulgarian authorities to conduct a proper search or investigation on premises. In what would become a tragic indictment of the official response, Bulgarian authorities largely abandoned the search soon after the incident. This investigative inertia, particularly concerning a high-profile case linked directly to a crucial geopolitical ally, suggested to some a measure of political deference. According to the usual narrative of this case, as a NATO partner, the Bulgarian state is highly sensitive to diplomatic pressure from Washington. Attempting to aggressively investigate an incident that may have occurred on American soil would pose significant political challenges. Facing this investigative void, Peter's father, Vladimir, was forced to become his own detective, initiating a years-long, exhausting campaign for answers. Despite this, he was unable to get any official word out of either Bulgarian police or American embassy staff. In a testament to his desperate struggle, he reportedly sent a personal letter to President Obama, pleading for intervention in the case of his vanished son. The official search for Peter was ultimately terminated following a controversial discovery far from Sofia. A body, described as disfigured, was found hanging from a tree in the distant Haskovo region. Bulgarian police quickly and firmly stated that the remains belonged to Peter, announcing the finding as the probable end of the mystery. This swift closure, however, was met with staunch disbelief by Peter's parents, who publicly stated their opinion that the body was not their son. Disturbingly, the Bulgarian police never released the results of a DNA test to the family, and even if it was confirmed to be him, this doesn't explain the bizarre circumstances by any means. Because Peter's disappearance occurred under conditions of total security control, the usual theories about his vanishing just don't hold water according to the usual narrative. And just wait for it, because I think there's a really simple way to explain this vanishing. Any plausible explanation must account for his successful exit from the embassy without being documented by either US or Bulgarian perimeter security. The persistent official silence from the American government regarding the disappearance has been viewed as highly suspicious by many online. However, having dug into it further, it looks as though embassies really don't comment on this sort of thing as a matter of course. Anyway, let's get into the theories, because they're weird, and then I'll finally explain what I actually think happened here. One theory suggests an internal incident and subsequent concealment by someone at the embassy. Peter may have suffered an unexpected medical event, or died during a high-stakes violent exchange inside the compound. Under this theory, someone in the embassy may have taken his body to be dumped. While it might be interesting to speculate about, there's just absolutely no evidence whatsoever to support this theory. A second theory centers on internal extraction or recruitment. Under this theory, Peter was identified as a potential valuable intelligence asset and recruited by a three-letter agency like the CIA. According to believers in this theory, this explains how he appears to have simply vanished from the consulate, but in my view, this theory collapses under very basic scrutiny. If an intelligence agency had secretly extracted or recruited Peter, the last thing they'd want is a media firestorm, yet that's exactly what his disappearance created. Intelligence agencies avoid messy public incidents because they draw attention, complicate operations, and risk diplomatic blowback. A covert recruitment wouldn't involve someone vanishing from a consulate in broad daylight, triggering headlines, political pressure, and international speculation. If this scenario were true, the situation would have been quietly managed, not turned into a public mystery. The chaos surrounding his disappearance points away from intelligence involvement, not toward it. My own take on this mystery is that we need to challenge our basic assumptions about this case. The central assumption driving the mystery is that Peter even entered the embassy that morning. Yet this quote-unquote fact rests entirely on the testimony of his two friends, who were the only individuals claiming to have watched him walk inside. Crucially, the embassy never publicly confirmed that Peter arrived or passed through security, and no Bulgarian investigators ever produced independent verification. While the lack of public confirmation from the embassy isn't unusual, I find it odd that Bulgarian investigators weren't able to independently verify it. So I think it didn't happen. Once you strip away the assumption that he entered the compound, a different picture emerges. The two friends' role becomes significantly more important, because their claim, "We saw him go in," is the single thread holding the entire embassy vanishing scenario together. If that thread snaps, the mystery shifts from a geopolitical puzzle to a far more familiar dynamic. The last people to see a missing man alive, providing the only version of events. When I reevaluate this case without assuming the embassy entry, the theories involving intelligence agencies, medical emergencies, or cover-ups become unnecessary leaps. The most straightforward explanation appears to be the answer. The only real conspiracy, if one exists, may lie with the two friends who controlled the narrative from the beginning. Until independent evidence proves Peter stepped into the consulate, the simplest answer is that he never did, and that the mystery starts outside the gate, not inside it. Hey everyone, just want to say thank you for all the support from every viewer, YouTube member, and patron. You guys make this all possible, and I appreciate you all so much. Now let's get back to business. And considering it's Thanksgiving tomorrow, I'm finally dropping a little segment I've been sitting on for a while. Millions of Japanese citizens were watching their television sets on October 12, 1960, expecting a standard political skirmish. Instead, they became involuntary witnesses to an act of breathtaking violence. Inajiro Asanuma, the robust chairman of the Japan Socialist Party, stood at the podium in Tokyo's Hibiya Hall when the sterile formality of the televised debate was shattered. An assassin dashed onto the stage with a wakizashi, a shorter variant of the more commonly known katana, and cut Asanuma down live in front of the entire nation. Immediately after, the question of whether the assassin was a lone wolf or acting on orders of a shadowy group would rear its head. Before his sudden demise, Asanuma was by far the most polarizing figure in Japanese opposition politics. Known for his powerful oratory and commanding presence, he represented the apex of left-wing power, serving as the chairman of the Socialist Party. The political climate of 1960 was defined by the massive, often turbulent opposition to the revision of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This was a period collectively known as the Anpo protests. Under Asanuma's leadership, the Socialists had steered these protests so effectively that they successfully forced the resignation of powerful Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi. This political victory made Asanuma a hero to the left, but simultaneously magnified the rage of the ultra-nationalist and far-right factions. These factions vehemently supported the American alliance and the treaty as essential for national security. These right-wing elements viewed the Socialists' anti-treaty stance as fundamentally undermining the nation's core interests and sovereignty. The political tension was already at a breaking point, creating a volatile environment where symbolic actions were perceived as outright treason. Asanuma had deliberately inflamed this situation by choosing an aggressively provocative form of diplomacy. In 1959, he met with Chairman Mao and took a bunch of very friendly pictures with him. If you're one of those people who just listen, I've got a picture of the two men up on screen right now. While this picture itself might not look like much, this photograph, which was widely reprinted at the time, would be one of the most important pictures in post-war Japanese history. At the time, Japan, closely allied with the United States, recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan as the legitimate Chinese government. To directly meet with Communist China's leader was, for many on the right, proof that he was planning to abandon the Americans and embrace Red China. The assassination took place during a crucial joint political debate held at Hibiya Public Hall in Tokyo, intended to kick off the general campaigning for the upcoming elections. Rhetoric ran extremely high, with the election being viewed as a fight for the soul of Japan. The stage was crowded with high-profile figures from across the political spectrum. The purpose was to showcase the power of democratic discourse, but the atmosphere was already charged with hostility, reflecting the polarization gripping the country. And I think it's important for me to mention here that Japan was only about a decade into their democratic experiment at this point. Asanuma began his address just after 3 in the afternoon, using his deep, resonant voice to denounce the controversial security pact with the United States. Even as he spoke, members of the far right present in the crowd began shouting insults like, "Shut up, communist," and showering the stage with leaflets. Asanuma, accustomed to such confrontations, initially ignored the heckling and continued his remarks. Suddenly, a young man, only 17 years old, erupted onto the stage. He wore the standard high-collared black student uniform and boots. Things were about to get real. This kid wasn't coming to hurl insults or call Asanuma a Mao sympathizer like most of the others who had come to denounce him. Clutched in his hands, held in a two-handed samurai-style grip, was a wakizashi, a traditional short sword, its bayonet-like blade measuring about a foot in length. The choice of this archaic weapon was deeply symbolic. It was a powerful rejection of modern political methods and democracy. The assassin intended his act not merely as an assassination, but as a divine punishment, delivered by a patriotic warrior against democracy as an institution. The attack was captured live by the cameras broadcasting the event, which documented every terrifying moment. Also, if you've never seen this image before, this is another time you're going to want to look at the screen if you just listen rather than watch. I've had to slightly crop the image, so if you want to see the full thing, Google's your friend. The assailant, Otoya Yamaguchi, lunged into Asanuma's large frame, driving the blade deep into his lower abdomen and liver in a powerful collision. There was so much force behind this blow that it sent the politician's notes flying and knocked the glasses straight off his face. As Asanuma stumbled, his face contorted in agony, Yamaguchi recovered his grip and delivered a decisive second thrust into the politician's chest. Colleagues rushed forward to subdue the youth, but the gravely wounded socialist leader wobbled and then collapsed. He was immediately rushed to a hospital but tragically succumbed to his injuries on the operating table. The sheer violence of the event, broadcast live to millions, was instantly immortalized by the photograph captured by Yasushi Nagao. And in case there was any doubt, this is the image I have cropped and put up on the screen for you. The perpetrator, Otoya Yamaguchi, was a figure steeped in the volatile ultranationalism of the era, despite his youth. Influenced initially by his older brother, he began attending speeches and participating in the increasingly frequent right-wing counter-protests. By age 16, his commitment was formalized when he joined the Greater Japan Patriotic Party, led by the right-wing ultranationalist Bin Akao. Akao had a profound impact on the youth with his warnings about impending communist revolution and promoted imagery of the People's Liberation Army in Tokyo. Yamaguchi was highly militant. Throughout the height of the Anpo crisis, he was arrested and released 10 times for his involvement in various counter-protests. This pattern of repeat engagement suggests a deeply rooted and rapidly intensifying ideological commitment. His stated motives for the attack were clear and uncompromising: a deep-seated opposition and resentment toward Asanuma's diplomatic overtures to Communist China. He also professed a strong desire to keep the status quo in relations with America, which again was seen as preventing the influence of the Soviets and Red China. Yamaguchi was convinced that his act was necessary to deter the spread of left-wing movements in Japan. Crucially, Yamaguchi strongly claimed he had grown increasingly disillusioned with Akao's leadership. He felt that the party focused too much on generating media attention rather than achieving meaningful, decisive action. This belief led him to a significant, calculated step. He formally resigned from the Greater Japan Patriotic Party just prior to the attack. In his later testimony to the police, the youth stated explicitly that he needed to be free of the party structure to take action. He then specifically said that Bin Akao would have specifically prevented him from carrying out the crime had he been aware of his plans. The assassination immediately triggered massive public suspicion regarding a wider political plot. For the Japan Socialist Party, the idea that a 17-year-old, acting completely unassisted, could organize and pull off the attack was unthinkable. The socialists quickly moved to control the narrative, framing it as an attack orchestrated by powerful, insidious forces aimed at destroying democracy. And this was a quote too good to pass up on, so here it is. One socialist leader condemned Yamaguchi as, quote, merely a cat's paw of monopolistic capitalistic forces. The The socialists themselves would come to blame the ruling Liberal Democratic Party rather than the far right, based on an analysis of who benefited most. The circumstances certainly fueled these suspicions. The public correctly perceived a massive institutional security failure. The assassin was, after all, a known far-right activist. Yet despite this, he was able to successfully infiltrate a stage containing all of the nation's top political figures. Following the attack, demonstrators marched on police headquarters, demanding the resignation of the police chief and accusing him of providing inadequate security. Most protesters expressed the belief that the cops deliberately allowed him to step onto the stage. The subsequent battles between demonstrators and police only compounded the impression of a state that had either deliberately stood down or was incompetent in protecting the opposition. The political calculus of the era provided further circumstantial grounding for the conspiracy theory. The assassination occurred at the peak of the socialist influence in Japan, immediately following their success in forcing a prime minister's resignation over the security treaty. Removing Asanuma, who provided charismatic leadership, accelerated the internal fragmentation of the party and drastically damaged its ability to present a cohesive message. The Socialist Party's view that the ruling Liberal Democratic Party could have been in on the attack was, for a time, very popular. While this conspiracy theory has died on the vine over the years, for lack of any evidence whatsoever, a more interesting and realistic theory has taken hold. Historically, far-right ultranationalist groups in Japan were often loosely connected with powerful conservative figures and corporate interests. In the period of rebuilding after 1945, they frequently served as tools for political intimidation against labor unions, or the left in general. Yamaguchi's deliberate decision to separate from his allegiances just prior to the attack may itself serve as evidence of coordinated involvement by far-right forces. Rather than undermining the conspiracy theory, his documented break with the organization could be interpreted as a calculated move to obscure direct connections. Yamaguchi's resignation may have been designed to create the appearance of an independent actor, free from organizational control. This apparent quest for ideological purity and autonomy can be seen as a sophisticated tactic to deflect suspicion and protect the interests of those who might have influenced his actions. Many have also considered it unusual how a 17-year-old who had just committed an extremist act was so insistent that he had no connections to anyone anymore. They also find it suspicious that he specifically said that the leaders of the ultranationalist party explicitly would have stopped him if he knew. What happened next would only deepen the idea that Yamaguchi wasn't acting alone. Less than 3 weeks after the attack, while confined in a Tokyo juvenile detention facility, Otoya Yamaguchi ensured his own narrative reached its desired dramatic conclusion. The 17-year-old assassin was discovered dead in his cell. He had torn strips from his own bedsheet and knotted them into a rope and had apparently ended himself, despite the fact he was under constant watch. Not to turn everything into American politics or anything, but that sounds really topical right now. Yamaguchi left behind a final, chilling declaration scrawled onto the cell wall. The message reaffirmed his ultimate loyalty. 7 lives for my country. 10,000 years for His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor. By invoking the phrase 7 lives, this references a legendary samurai's pledge of continuous reincarnation to serve the Emperor over and over again. By doing this, Yamaguchi powerfully linked his act to the ideals of patriotic sacrifice and devotion to the imperial throne. In this act of eliminating himself, he avoided a protracted investigation which may have revealed the full extent of his political backing. In the wake of Asanuma's sudden violent death, the Japan Socialist Party struggled desperately to maintain coherence and momentum. The loss of his robust and experienced leadership created a vacuum that proved impossible to fill. His successor quickly attempted to steer the party toward a more centrist platform, in a move that fed into the conspiracy theories swirling about. This rapid doctrinal shift alienated the revolutionary socialist and communist elements within the party, resulting in severe and damaging infighting. The assassination, regardless of whether it was ordered by shadowy figures behind the scenes or not, proved strategically fatal for the opposition. Over the decades that followed, the Socialist Party's influence steadily diminished, a decline that continued relentlessly until the party's ultimate extinction in 1996. In June 1989, Joanne Roselle spent an evening at the Meridian Lanes bowling alley in Oklahoma City with her ex-husband and children. After a heated argument with her ex inside, the 29-year-old stepped outside around 11:30 to cool off, and she never came back. Joanne left behind her car and even her shoes. She walked out barefoot, wearing an orange blouse with a bow on the back and blue jeans. Her family launched an immediate search for her, and when she didn't turn up, her grandmother reported her missing 4 days later. At the time, some locals wondered if she had left to start a new life, or been held against her will by someone, but no answers emerged. Police circulated her description and appealed for tips, yet they had few leads and no evidence to explain her sudden disappearance. Over 6 months later, on January 5, 1990, a survey crew discovered a human skull in a creek bed near the town of Geary in Canadian County, a rural area west of Oklahoma City. Investigators searched the scene and recovered roughly half of a human skeleton scattered near the creek. They also found some women's clothing and a gold ring with a heart-shaped design near the remains. Forensic examination determined the victim was a white female, likely in her 20s or 30s, and that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators now had a brutal slaying on their hands, but they still didn't know the victim's name. The clothing at the scene couldn't be conclusively linked to any known missing person. Curiously, some items didn't match what Roselle had been wearing when she vanished. Authorities even commissioned a forensic artist to create a clay reconstruction of the Jane Doe's face in hopes of recognition, but no identification followed. And as usual, with these clay reconstructions, they're absolutely awful and look like something out of a low-budget horror movie. The unknown woman was dubbed the Canadian County Jane Doe. Detectives chased numerous leads, but none yielded a name for the victim. With no breakthroughs, Joanne Roselle's missing person case went cold. In 2003, her son had her declared legally dead in absentia, not knowing his mother's remains had actually been found years before. Meanwhile, the Canadian County Jane Doe investigation also stalled for decades. Early DNA testing attempts on the remains in the 1990s were unsuccessful, and hundreds of tips over the years brought no answers. The unidentified victims' details were entered into national databases, but no match was made. In 2024, a breakthrough finally arrived. Cold case investigators from Canadian County teamed up with a private forensic DNA laboratory. Using forensic genetic genealogy, they were able to tie the Canadian County Jane Doe to Joanne Roselle in November 2025. Joanne's case has now been reopened as an active investigation after sitting virtually completely dormant for decades. The Canadian County Sheriff's Office has informed her family of the discovery and is actively pursuing new leads to find who was responsible for her death. Investigators noted that someone likely transported Joanne's body from Oklahoma City to that remote creek, indicating a deliberate effort to hide the crime. They're re-examining people in her life from 1989, including the ex-husband who was with her that night, for any possible involvement. Although investigators are naturally revisiting Joanne's ex-husband due to the argument at the bowling alley, There are legitimate reasons to question his involvement. His whereabouts that night were known and verified, and there's no evidence he left the area or traveled to the remote creek bed in Canadian County where Joanne was ultimately found. The location of the remains suggests someone had both opportunity and mobility to transport a body more than an hour away. This is a window of time that doesn't clearly align with his confirmed timeline, assuming the details we know are correct. That said, of course, this doesn't necessarily rule out his involvement, since more than one person can be in on a crime. I have to question whether Joanne was dating anyone at the time this occurred, and my reasoning for this is based on a piece of confirmed evidence. She was wearing different clothing. To me, this suggests that she may have gone to a boyfriend's house, got changed, and something may have happened there. That said, this is purely speculative, since we don't even have evidence to indicate she was dating someone at the time. At any rate, I hope to have an update on this case at some point in the near future, given that this major break in the case was recent. Imagine a killer so notorious, so feared, that the state, upon his death, decided not just to bury him, but to disassemble him. Matti Haapoja, Finland's most infamous serial predator of the 19th century, was confirmed to have killed only 3 people during his decades-long rampage. Yet reasonable historical estimates suggest his true victim count could soar as high as 30. In 1895, after a life marked with brutal violence, he claimed his final victim inside a prison cell in Turku, Finland. But the story doesn't end there. In a chilling demonstration of state power attempting to finally contain his defiance, his remains became institutional property. His physical relics, including patches of his skin, were collected for the Prison Administration Museum, turning the notorious villain into an enduring, macabre cultural artifact. This unusual act solidified his status. Haapoja was never just a criminal. He was a symbol whose myth had to be literally contained and displayed. Also, I know I have more than a few Finnish viewers, so I apologize for my pronunciations, but your language is literally impossible for me to pronounce. Matti Haapoja was born in 1845 in Isokiro, located in the tumultuous region of southern Ostrobothnia, and grew up in the nearby area of Listaro. He was the son of a farmer. His early life unfolded within a unique and violent social environment known as the Puukkojunkkarit, or knife fighters. This phenomenon, which peaked between the 1820s and 1880s, was characterized by widespread brawling, theft, and antagonism toward authority. Criminologists have long understood that this violence stemmed from deep-seated social frustration. Economic conditions in Ostrobothnia meant that land could not be endlessly distributed, creating a large population of younger, landless men who couldn't inherit their own farms. This frustration was often expressed through aggression, particularly at large, alcohol-fueled social gatherings like weddings. Haapoja quickly embraced this subculture, beginning his criminal trajectory as a brawler and notorious horse thief. Records show he non-fatally wounded at least 6 men in knife fights. For Haapoja, violent acts weren't just opportunistic crimes, they were markers of identity and power. In the community of knife fighters, the ultimate status symbol was to kill or wound another respected fighter. He openly sought recognition within this anti-establishment framework, reportedly declaring himself the king of all these gangs. His first known homicide occurred on December 6, 1867, when he fatally stabbed his drinking partner, farmer Heikki Imponen, during a drunken altercation. For this slaying, Haapoja received a 12-year sentence to hard labor at the Turku Penitentiary. The sentence began a cycle of imprisonment and defiance that defined the rest of his life. From 1809 to 1917, Finland was controlled by the Russian Empire in a semi-autonomous personal union known as the Grand Duchy of Finland. The Grand Duke of Finland was the Russian Tsar, but the day-to-day governing of the country was largely left to the populace of Sweden, rather than being dictated from Russia. The repressive penal environment of 19th century Finland was inherited from the Russian authoritarian model. This was characterized by prisoners having virtually no rights and being worked to death in prison. This system would prove insufficient to contain Hapoya. Following his initial conviction, his defiance of authority only intensified. Over the subsequent decade, Hapoya became notorious for repeatedly escaping the Turku prison. He broke out 4 times and spent significant periods at large on each occasion. These continuous escapes were a direct dramatic challenge to the rigid state structure. Weirdly, considering the crimes he committed, he became something of a folk hero in his own lifetime, with his opposition to authority seen as an expression of Finnish nationalism. Of course, his actions while free clearly showed that he was no freedom fighter standing up against the Russian behemoth. His exploits were heavily reported and sensationalized by the contemporary press. In August 1876, a Finnish farmer caught him robbing his lands, and Hapoya beat him up and then shot him in the face. Later, in January 1879, Hapoya stabbed a farmer who attempted to place him under something like a citizen's arrest. His growing notoriety served as a psychological shield. The continuous cycle of escaping, committing new offenses, and evading capture generated widespread fear. The perception that Hapoya was unstoppable was so strong that even local populations often didn't dare report his wrongdoings to the authorities. People were afraid that if they turned him in, that he'd simply escape and exact his revenge. Media coverage didn't help, as they portrayed Matti Hapoya as something akin to a force of nature who couldn't be stopped. Hapoya's consistent failure to conform resulted in his eventual exile to Siberia for forced labor in the Imperial Russian version of a gulag. This period in the late 1880s marks the most obscure, yet likely the most prolific phase of his killing career, a phase that stretched his violence across the Russian imperial frontier. During his time in the Russian penal colonies, Hapoya is linked to a chilling cluster of killings. These victims include an unidentified man in 1886, a Finnish convict known as Jaakko in 1888, and 2 men killed in the Siberian city of Tomsk in 1889. Speaking of 1889, that was a really prolific year for Hapoya. In that year, he was seen hanging out with a Baltic German convict named Gustav Sepp. After going for a walk with Hapoya, Sepp was never seen again. However, since Hapoya never claimed to have killed him, some speculate that he helped Sepp escape the prison. In Finland, he generally was only violent to other knife fighters or to people he was trying to rob. Some have noted that the killings in Siberia appear to be more predatory, targeting other convicts and opportunistic victims in remote locations. These attacks in Siberia appear to have been done purely for the thrill of violence, rather than for any other reason. This transition indicates a move toward calculated serial violence, exploiting the complete chaos and systemic lack of oversight inherent in the distant Russian penal colonies. Because of the vastness of the empire and extremely poor documentation, finding out the true number of victims during this time is considered an impossible task for historians. Hapoya eventually found his way back to Finland, but his violent habits hadn't diminished. In October 1890, he committed what became arguably his most infamous documented crime, the strangulation of Maria Jemina Salo. This is his first known slaying of a woman, which many believe indicates that he had been committing these acts before and simply had never been caught. The Salo slaying immediately dominated the national press, and he was held in captivity pending trial. Driven by a hunger for sensational content and capitalizing on global anxieties about urban crime, journalists quickly equated Hapoya to Jack the Ripper. Hapoya's final acts of violence occurred within the walls of the state institutions he had spent his life fighting. On October 10th, 1894, his criminal span concluded with a fatal attack on prison guard Juho Rosted, whom Hapoya stabbed to death. In 1895, just as he was about to be sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, he decided to end it all. Some have interpreted this as a last defiant snub to the authority of the court. Matti Hapoya was ultimately found guilty of only 3 slayings, spanning the years from 1867 to 1894. However, the shadow cast by his exploits suggests that the official tally represents only a fraction of his true toll. A figure often repeated in folklore and historical accounts claims that Hapoya confessed to 18 killings. Critically, there are no documented details concerning this supposed confession, leading experts to regard the figure as unreliable. But here's the thing. Based upon a review of the limited records we have from his time in Siberia, many historians think that this number, made up to sound high, is actually too low. Despite the lack of firm evidence for the confession, the most credible historical estimates place his overall victim count much higher than the confirmed 3. Many believe that he may have killed between 20 to 30 people over the course of his life. This broad estimate acknowledges the likelihood that unreported attacks, especially from his Siberian period, is extremely high. Anyway, to the surprise of no one, I'm not fluent in Finnish, and I had to rely on translation software when looking at sources since there isn't much out there in English. It seems to me that Hapoya, despite his disturbing crimes, has a folkloric status, kind of like someone like Billy the Kid for us. If you're Finnish, it would be great if you could confirm or deny this, since the language barrier and limited English sources made it difficult for me to figure this out. It's nearly impossible to imagine a lethal state-sponsored geopolitical conflict erupting in the tranquil academic environment of Japan. Yet, that's precisely what happened 37 miles northeast of Tokyo in the summer of 1991. The setting was the University of Tsukuba campus, and the victim was Professor Hitoshi Igarashi. The professor's death was a deliberate, violent consequence of a clash that originated thousands of miles away. It transformed an academic dispute over literature into an international incident of assassination. Igarashi, a professor of Islamic culture, had committed the singular, fatal act of translating Salman Rushdie's profoundly controversial novel, The Satanic Verses, into Japanese. His killing, carried out on July 11, 1991, starkly demonstrated that the religious decree, or fatwa, issued by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini of Iran 2 years earlier, was very real. The decree explicitly called for the death of the author and anyone, quote, involved in its publication. Igarashi's assassination proved that the lethal contract was global and extended to countries which possessed relative geopolitical distance from the epicenter of the controversy. If a scholar in a secure, culturally distinct democracy could be targeted, the message to every publisher, bookseller, and translator across the world was unmistakable. To this day, the person responsible for the slaying of Professor Igarashi still remains at large, and given Japan's statute of limitations as it then existed, the crime can't be prosecuted. Hitoshi Igarashi, born in 1947, was no casual observer of Islamic civilization. He was an internationally acclaimed expert in Arabic and Persian literature and history. His entire career was dedicated to bridging cultural understanding and intellectual dialogue between Japan and the Islamic world. His rigorous academic background included completing his doctoral program in Islamic art at the University of Tokyo. This was followed by service as a research fellow at the Royal Academy of Iran, a position he held until the Iranian Revolution in 1979. As an associate professor at Tsukuba University, his scholarship resulted in insightful books on Islamic history, alongside significant translation projects. The decision to translate the Satanic verses was one taken with full knowledge of the profound risks. It's reported that 5 other translators had already refused the task, demonstrating the immediate fear the fatwa had instilled in the Japanese literary community. Igarashi, however, stepped forward, transforming the purely academic act of translation into an explicit defense of freedom of thought. He understood the potential danger, acknowledging that he was indeed one of the targets identified by the fatwa's chilling logic. Despite this awareness, he declined the offer of security protection extended by the police, adhering to an almost stoic conviction. He even publicly remarked that scholars shouldn't be preoccupied with the potential negative outcomes of their work. The origins of the violence lay in the February 14, 1989 decree issued by Iran's then supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. This legal order condemned Salman Rushdie and anyone responsible for the publication or distribution of his book. Crucially, the threat evolved from a general indictment into a monetized, systematic campaign of violence. While the original fatwa didn't explicitly name translators, a state-sponsored Iranian foundation promised financial support for anyone who acted on it. Igarashi's slaying on July 11, 1991, occurred just 8 days after a separate attack across the world. Ettore Capriolo, the novel's Italian translator, had been stabbed and seriously wounded in his apartment in Milan on July 3, 1991. These sequential, near-simultaneous attacks on 2 academic targets on separate continents confirmed that the Iranian decree had dramatically expanded its operational scope. It had moved beyond the high-profile author into the logistical chain of publishing and translation. Professor Igarashi's body was discovered on the morning of July 12, 1991, in a building on the University of Tsukuba's campus, lying near the staircase in the hallway outside his office. The autopsy determined that the fatal attack had occurred late the previous night, sometime after 10 on July 11th. The nature of the assault was particularly brutal. The professor had been stabbed repeatedly in the face and arms by an unknown assailant. These defensive wounds and the targeting of the face suggest an attack intended not just to kill, but to viciously silence and perhaps even disfigure the victim. The immediate investigation by Japanese authorities found no clear clues and failed to apprehend the perpetrator. However, a remarkable piece of evidence was found on Igarashi's office desk. It was a quick poem that, disturbingly, said that he would be assassinated and that his body would be found near the staircase. Despite the immediate worldwide notoriety of the case and the clear link to the geopolitical controversy, Igarashi's slaying remains officially unsolved. The Japanese police were unable to identify, charge, or convict the individual responsible for the fatal stabbing, allowing the perpetrator to remain at large for years. The failure of the domestic legal process was sealed in 2006 when, 15 years after the crime, the statute of limitations for the stabbing expired under Japanese law. This formally terminated the possibility of domestic prosecution for the attack. Some have speculated that Iran's Revolutionary Guard may have targeted Igarashi directly, though there's no direct evidence that this is the case. Others have speculated that it was someone either motivated by fanaticism or perhaps by Iran's promise to provide payment and support for anyone who committed such an attack. Still others have speculated that the translation may not have been the cause of the attack at all, but rather a smokescreen used by someone with a personal grudge against him. Igarashi had been publicly attacked previously over the translation, and it does remain a possibility that someone with an axe to grind saw this as the ideal opportunity to make a move. If this was the case, it worked, since the Japanese police dedicated all their resources into the theory that this was the result of the fatwa. At any rate, if the person responsible wants to come forth and admit to the crime now, they're free to do so with no criminal repercussions due to Japan's statute of limitation laws. It was an ordinary day in May 1989 when construction workers in Bullhead City, Arizona, made a chilling discovery. As they dug a trench for utility lines on a vacant lot, their backhoe struck something unexpected, a shallow grave containing human skeletal remains. They had unknowingly stumbled upon a decades-old mystery that still haunts the community, the unsolved slaying of a young woman dubbed Castleberry Kate by investigators. Investigators soon determined the skeletal remains belonged to a female around 17 to 19 years old. The body had been concealed on an undeveloped stretch of Castleberry Lane, near the intersection with Riverside Drive, in a then remote part of the city. Based on the condition of the bones, forensic experts estimated she had been killed sometime between 1979 and 1987. The cause of death was officially ruled a homicide, though the details of why investigators came to this conclusion aren't publicly available. At that time, Bullhead City was expanding rapidly, but the Castleberry Lane lot was still empty desert on the outskirts of town. This isolation meant that whoever buried the victim likely did so without any neighbors around to notice. After years exposed to the elements, any other evidence, such as footprints or tire tracks, had long since been erased. With no identification on the remains and no immediate clues at the scene, the mystery of who this young woman was and who cut her life short was just beginning. Authorities determined the victim was likely a white female between 17 and 19 years old, standing about 5 feet 7 inches tall. Her hair was dark to medium brown and approximately 12 inches long, with evidence that she had bleached it at some point. Due to the remains being skeletal, eye color and weight could not be determined, though from the skeleton it was clear that she was never severely overweight nor severely underweight. Forensic artists even created a facial reconstruction to illustrate how Castleberry Kate might have looked in life. The hope was that someone would recognize her face and come forward with a name or a clue. The nickname itself was inspired by the street name of the discovery site, and it quickly became how investigators and locals referred to this unknown girl. Personally, I think these sort of nicknames do a lot to humanize a Jane or John Doe case, and I think this is a practice that should be adopted more widely. One striking detail was the extensive dental work she had undergone. 2 of the young woman's upper teeth were missing prior to her death, replaced by a partial denture plate. This is an unusual feature for a teenager that might be a key to identifying her. This suggests she had access to good dental care in life, and indeed her dental records were cataloged so authorities could compare them against those of missing persons. But back to that first point, it also seemingly paradoxically suggests that at some point in her life she may have had very poor dental care. While I haven't seen anything to confirm this, perhaps she suffered neglect at the hands of her biological parents, and then others stepped in. Investigators also noted the personal items found with the remains, though most of these haven't been disclosed. That said, it's recorded that there were women's clothing, and very importantly, a purse, though the contents again haven't been revealed. Notably, one thing which was revealed is that she wore a distinctive owl-shaped earring. Unfortunately, I can't show you this, since there's no image of it in the databases. From the start, local authorities gave this case significant attention, but progress was painfully slow. No witnesses came forward, which isn't surprising, given that the lot was isolated desert scrubland back then, and given the passage of time. Detectives checked missing persons reports in Arizona and across the country, looking for anyone who matched Castleberry Kate's description and distinctive dental profile. Over the years, at least 20 potential matches were compared and ruled out, including several teenagers who vanished in the late 1970s and early 1980s. For example, Tara Calico from New Mexico was considered a possible match, but investigators concluded she wasn't Castleberry Kate. In the decades since the discovery, forensic technology has advanced dramatically. Early DNA testing on the skeletal remains was attempted, but the degraded samples did not initially yield a usable profile. For years, investigators had only dental records and physical clues to work with. Recently, however, there was a breakthrough. A DNA profile was finally generated from the remains, offering a new avenue to pursue. By 2025, the case was taken on by a nonprofit organization that uses genetic genealogy to identify unknown victims. Experts are now analyzing Castleberry Kate's DNA, comparing it against genealogy databases to trace her family lineage in hopes of uncovering her real name. This cutting-edge effort has given investigators renewed hope that after nearly 36 years, they might soon learn who Castleberry Kate truly was. What strikes me most about the case of Castleberry Kate isn't just the isolation of the grave, but the poignant contradictions in the evidence left behind. As I noted earlier, the moniker itself does heavy lifting here. Giving her a name, even a temporary one derived from a street sign, forces us to see the teenager, not just the case number. She was found in Mojave County, and there's an alternative reality out there, where she's simply cataloged as Mojave Jane Doe. In an era where these victims rely on a compelling story to generate interest, so a nonprofit will jump in and identify the person, the Castleberry Kate name is huge. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit there, but I think it needs to be said. The dental evidence also presents a heartbreaking paradox that I can't shake. To have multiple upper teeth missing by age 19 suggests a history of trauma, malnutrition, or severe neglect. Yet the existence of a partial denture proves that, at some later point, someone cared enough and had the funds to fix it. It paints a picture of a life that was perhaps turning a corner, possibly thanks to the intervention of guardians or grandparents, before it was cruelly interrupted. Then there's the owl earring. It's deeply frustrating that we can't see the design, as that specific piece of jewelry could have triggered a memory. For instance, maybe a jeweler would have recognized it, or maybe someone would have said, "Oh hey, that's my friend's owl earring. Haven't heard from her in a number of years." There's also a clear potential pitfall here in relation to genetic genealogy. And yeah, I'm fully aware many of you like to joke that I think that this is a magical technique, but there are limitations. If she was adopted, this would create a significant extra hurdle, since her genetic relatives would likely have no knowledge of her whereabouts. It's also possible she could have been a traveler from Europe, where they have different privacy laws concerning this sort of thing. Anyway, hopefully science can finally give her name back and finish the story that this cruel perpetrator tried to use the desert to erase. In the quiet, rolling hills of upstate New York, a young couple named Juanetta and Tim Hoyt were living through an unimaginable nightmare. Between 1965 and 1971, they buried 5 of their children. First came Eric, then James and Julie, followed by Molly and Noah. One by one, they were laid to rest, each death a fresh wave of grief that left their small community heartbroken. For more than 20 years, their story was a medical tragedy, a case study in the cruel randomness of a newly understood condition. But a single decades-old medical paper held a clue to a different, more horrifying truth. This truth that would eventually reveal their story wasn't one of a tragic medical mystery at all. The pattern of death in the Hoyt household was as relentless as it was heartbreaking. It began in January 1965, when their firstborn, Eric, died at just 3 months old. Two more children followed: James, born in 1966, and Julie, born in 1968. In September 1968, tragedy struck twice in 3 weeks. First, 48-day-old Julie died, and then 28-month-old James followed. Two more children, Molly and Noah, were born in 1970 and 1971, respectively. Both also died within a few months of their birth. In each case, the cause of death was listed as SIDS, a diagnosis that, at the time, was shrouded in mystery and fear. Hoyt's crimes unfolded during a unique moment in medical history. The term was only formally introduced in 1969, following years of varied and often incorrect theories about why seemingly healthy infants perished in their sleep. It was a diagnosis of exclusion, applied when a thorough investigation and autopsy could find no other explanation. This lack of definitive knowledge created a diagnostic fog. For grieving parents, it offered a non-blaming explanation for an unbearable loss. For a predator like Juanetta Hoyt, however, it provided the perfect cover. Her crimes coincided precisely with the period when the medical community had just enough knowledge to name the phenomenon, but not enough to distinguish it from a covert slaying. The Hoyt family's tragedy was so profound that it attracted the attention of Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, a pediatrician at Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. The last two Hoyt babies, Molly and Noah, became subjects in his study. Juanita reported that the infants suffered from breathing difficulties, and they were admitted to the hospital for monitoring. Molly even became the first baby in the United States to be sent home with an apnea monitor. Despite this, both children perished shortly after being discharged. In October 1972, Dr. Steinschneider published his findings in the journal Pediatrics. The paper, which referred to the Hoyts only as Family H, proposed that SIDS could be caused by prolonged apnea and that this condition might run in families. The 5 Hoyt deaths served as the tragic proof of his hypothesis. The truth remained buried until 1985, when a prosecutor from a neighboring county, William Fitzpatrick, was working on an unrelated case with similar facts. He consulted with Dr. Linda Norton, a forensic pathologist from Dallas, who reviewed Steinschneider's 1972 paper. She saw something different in the data, not a medical anomaly, but a pattern of a predator. She gave Fitzpatrick a chilling warning. He might have a serial perpetrator in his area. The warning stayed with Fitzpatrick. When he was elected district attorney in 1992, he used his new authority to track down the anonymous Family H. He sent the case files to Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist with the New York State Police. After reviewing the medical records and the autopsies of the exhumed remains, the physician's conclusion was unequivocal. Juanetta Hoyt was a monster. In March 1994, investigators made their move. A state trooper who knew Juanita approached her at a post office and, using a clever ruse, he invited her to participate in a quote-unquote new research project on mothers who had been affected by SIDS. She agreed. During the subsequent interrogation, the friendly facade dropped, and under questioning, Juanetta Hoyt confessed. She admitted to everything, and her motive was both shockingly simple and profoundly evil. The babies wouldn't stop crying, and she wanted to silence them. She described her methods in chilling detail, admitting she had used pillows, a bath towel, and the pressure of her own shoulder to smother them. Almost immediately, however, she recanted, claiming her confession was coerced. The validity of that confession became the central issue of her trial. The defense hired a forensic psychologist who concluded that Hoyt's dependent and avoidant personality disorders made her uniquely vulnerable to manipulative police tactics. Then, in a stunning development, even the prosecution's own psychiatric expert agreed that she was vulnerable and the police had manipulated her. The 1995 trial pitted two eras of science against each other. The prosecution, led by Fitzpatrick, built its case on Baden's modern forensic analysis and Hoyt's detailed confession. The defense countered with Dr. Steinschneider, who stood by his original SIDS diagnosis and argued that the confession was worthless. Prosecutors also speculated that Hoyt may have been suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This was a then-emerging psychological disorder in which a parent gains attention and sympathy through fabricated medical issues with a child. In April 1995, a jury found Winetta Hoyt guilty, and she was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. But the story had one final bizarre twist. In August 1998, Hoyt died of pancreatic cancer before her appeal could be heard. Under New York law, because she died with her appeal still pending, her conviction was formally vacated. While a jury had declared her guilty, her legal record was officially wiped clean. According to legend, there's a phenomenon so powerful that it simultaneously sedates an entire nation. It's late afternoon on the fourth Thursday of November. Across millions of households, the clamor of family gatherings has quieted to a low rumble of televised football and the rhythmic breathing of your Uncle Mike. Belts are loosened, eyes are heavy, and the collective consciousness of the country drifts into a hazy stupor. For decades, many pointed an accusing finger at the centerpiece of the table, the turkey. But is this bird truly a natural sedative, or have we been scapegoating an innocent fowl for our own gluttonous choices? The legend of the turkey coma is built on a foundation of scientific truth that has been warped by pop culture. The primary suspect in this culinary crime is tryptophan, an essential amino acid. The logic seems sound on the surface. Your body uses tryptophan to produce serotonin, a neurotransmitter that helps regulate mood. Serotonin is then converted into melatonin, the hormone responsible for regulating your sleep-wake cycles. Therefore, the theory goes, eating turkey loads your system with tryptophan, boosts your melatonin, and knocks you out cold. It's a neat little explanation that gives us a scientific-sounding excuse for passing out on the couch before the dishes are done. However, like many urban myths, this explanation crumbles when you look at the actual biochemistry involved. If turkey were truly a potent sleeping pill, we'd see evidence of its power year-round. Consider that a standard turkey sandwich consumed at a desk on a Tuesday in March rarely results in an immediate nap. The numbers simply don't support the myth. According to nutrition data from sources like the USDA, turkey contains roughly the same amount of tryptophan as chicken or beef. More damning to the theory is the fact that many other common foods pack a significantly higher tryptophan punch. Cheddar cheese, soybeans, and even pumpkin seeds contain more of this amino acid per ounce than your beloved November bird. If tryptophan were the sole driver of drowsiness, a grilled cheese sandwich or a handful of nuts would be far more sedating than a slice of turkey breast measure for measure. So, if the turkey isn't guilty, this naturally poses the question of who or what is. The answer lies in the side dishes. The mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and pies are the true agents of your lethargy. We're dealing with a caloric event that often exceeds 3,000 calories in a single sitting. When you consume such a massive volume of food, your body must divert resources to handle it. The parasympathetic nervous system, often called the rest and digest system, kicks into high gear. Blood flow is directed away from the brain and toward the gastrointestinal tract to aid digestion, naturally leaving you feeling less alert. Combine this with the depressive effects of wine or beer, the tiredness from travel, and perhaps the exhaustion of cooking, and you have a perfect physiological recipe for a nap. Ultimately, blaming the turkey is a convenient way to avoid facing the reality of our holiday excess. The bird is a passenger on a vehicle driven by massive amounts of calories and huge portion sizes. In the end, the idea that the tryptophan in turkey is what causes you to fall asleep is just an urban myth that keeps growing in the telling. Hey everyone, just dropping that usual reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons and ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications. And don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're watching from or what you're up to while you're listening. One cold February night in 1991, 32-year-old Dee Dee Rosenthal vanished without a trace from her Cherry Hill, New Jersey apartment. She left behind all her personal belongings and even her beloved pet cat, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The eerie scene and a handful of strange clues have continued to baffle her family and investigators for well over 3 decades. But perhaps the most disturbing part is that the person responsible was likely a man who had been given access to her apartment by the building management. Dee Dee Rosenthal was a 32-year-old behavioral therapist originally from Canada who moved to New Jersey in 1990 to work with autistic children. By 1991, she was living alone at the Somerset Towers apartment complex and was known as a caring, dedicated professional. However, Dee Dee was also struggling financially, and she had borrowed money from family, was behind on rent, and faced eviction from her apartment. These financial strains led the cops to initially believe that this Canadian may have simply gone back home, wasting valuable early investigative time. On Friday, February 22, 1991, Dee Dee left work as usual and headed home to start her weekend. That night, she spoke by phone with her boyfriend around 10 o'clock, her last known contact. When Dee Dee didn't show up for work on Monday, her colleagues grew worried. 2 days later, on February 27th, they filed a missing person report and met police at Dee Dee's apartment. Inside Dee Dee's third-floor apartment, police found no signs of a struggle or forced entry. The unit was tidy and undisturbed. Her bed was made and all her personal belongings were left in place. Her white Honda Prelude was still parked outside with her work briefcase inside, and the Sunday newspaper lay untouched at her door. Most unsettling of all, Dee Dee's pet cat was discovered shivering on her balcony, locked outside in the winter cold. Friends noted that Dee Dee adored her cat and would never leave it behind like that, a clue which should have indicated that she didn't simply skip town. But there was more, and a neighbor reported hearing a scream and a heavy thud in the middle of that weekend night. This was followed by the sound of a sliding door, suggesting an intruder may have struck during those early morning hours. And keep this sliding door noise in mind, because it'll be a major factor going forward. Initially, police did very little and wrote her off as someone deeply in debt who simply left the country. In the weeks that followed, some bizarre clues raised hopes that she might be alive, but perhaps not well. A bartender in another town nearby reported meeting a disoriented woman who resembled Dee Dee and called herself Lori. This woman appeared to be undergoing some sort of mental health crisis, and the bartender tried to keep her there until the cops arrived, but Lori moved along quickly. Around the same time, Dee Dee's relatives received strange phone calls. In one, a female voice quietly said, "Mama, I'm okay," before hanging up. These tantalizing leads ultimately went nowhere, and the authorities grew skeptical that she had disappeared voluntarily. The mystery remained unsolved for over 4 years. Then, in October 1995, a breakthrough occurred. Police arrested 34-year-old Charles Edward Reddish, the former handyman from Dee Dee's apartment building, for an unrelated slaying. Reddish, who was known by the street name Crazy Eddie, had eliminated his girlfriend and then committed horrific acts to her teen daughter. Upon learning of Reddish's arrest, Cherry Hill investigators interrogated him about Dee Dee's case. At the time of the original investigation, Reddish had been questioned and had denied any knowledge of Dee Dee's disappearance. Now, faced with new scrutiny, he shockingly confessed that he had slain Dee Dee Rosenthal. According to Reddish's signed confession, he was high on coke on the night of February 22, 1991, and decided to break into Dee Dee's apartment while she slept. He used his maintenance worker credentials to access the building, and then he climbed onto her balcony, perhaps from an empty unit, and entered through the unlocked sliding door. He claimed he had just intended to steal valuables when she awoke and began to scream. Reddish panicked and attacked. He beat Dee Dee and then suffocated her with a pillow to silence her. After this, he stole about $80 from her purse and fled the apartment, leaving her body as evidence. A couple of days later, noticing newspapers piling up outside Dee Dee's door, Reddish returned to dispose of her body and cover up the crime. During this time, he also claims to have cleaned up the crime scene, explaining why the apartment was found in such a tidy state. He wrapped Dee Dee's body in her bedspread and a plastic tarp, loaded it onto a maintenance cart, and wheeled it out to the parking lot. Using his girlfriend's car, he transported the body to a remote area off Route 130 in rural Salem County and dumped it in an area of thick weeds and brush. He claimed that he later even told his girlfriend what he had done, though this was the same woman he had subsequently killed, so the truth of that couldn't be verified. When Reddish recounted these details to police in 1995, they found his story credible. He knew facts about the crime that only the perpetrator could have known. Acting on his information, investigators took him to the supposed dump site in an attempt to locate Dee Dee's remains. Unfortunately, the search was unsuccessful. Over the years, sediment and debris had been repeatedly dumped in that area, and no trace of Dee Dee was ever found. The site had been repeatedly dredged up, and if what he was saying was true, whatever remained of her would essentially be a needle in a haystack. Reddish's confession allowed authorities to finally charge him for Dee Dee's slaying. Despite the previous failed search, he agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter in 2001 if he successfully led police to Dee Dee's body. However, when the time came for the second search, he refused to cooperate in the effort, so the deal was revoked and he went to trial instead. During his 2001 trial, Reddish astonishingly recanted his confession. He claimed that he had hallucinated the whole thing, and his lawyer argued that the Lori sightings proved she was still alive. The jury didn't believe these claims, and faced with the taped confession, they found him guilty of this capital offense. In 2002, Reddish was sentenced to death, but New Jersey later abolished capital punishment, and in 2004 his death sentence was overturned on appeal. His penalty was commuted to a prison term of 30 to 60 years, on top of the life sentence he was already serving for his girlfriend's slaying. In a heartbreaking twist, her family still held on to the belief that the Lori sightings could be proof that Reddish's story wasn't legitimate. Personally, though, I strongly suspect the Lori sighting was just a red herring. Given that the man known as Crazy Eddie had virtually free access to Dee Dee's unit, and given that we know of his sick proclivities, there's little doubt in my mind that he was responsible. Whether he was telling the truth about where he dumped her body or not is an entirely different question. Unfortunately, Lori's parents have since passed away, but I can only hope that for her remaining family that her body is one day discovered. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a quick reminder to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to take your support to the next level. Also, don't forget to tap the like button if you haven't done so already, since this really helps my video reach a wider audience. The Connecticut River Valley, stretching through the heart of New England, is known for its quiet majesty, its covered bridges, and its profound rural peace. But for one terrifying decade, this pastoral backdrop was stalked by a predator whose signature was unfettered personal rage. This was the Connecticut River Valley Killer, who claimed the lives of at least 7 innocent young women between 1978 and 1988. The initial attacks seemed unconnected, spread out across years in the sparsely populated region. This made it difficult for law enforcement across state lines to immediately realize they were facing a common perpetrator. The terror began in the autumn of 1978 with 27-year-old Catherine Milliken. She was an avid photographer and was last seen near the Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve in New London, New Hampshire, where she had gone to photograph birds. Her body was discovered bearing a brutal signature that would define the predator's future crimes. She had been stabbed at least 29 times. This overwhelming degree of violence immediately suggested a deeply personal or rage-driven motivation. This led to the authorities looking deeply into people she was close to, but one by one, everyone was ruled out. 3 years passed before the next confirmed victim. In July 1981, 37-year-old Mary Elizabeth Critchley, a University of Vermont student, disappeared. She had been hitchhiking near Interstate 91, close to the Massachusetts-Vermont border, traveling north toward Waterbury in Vermont. Her body was later recovered in what would later be seen as a growing pattern of violence, targeting women alone near major transportation corridors in the remote area. However, at that time, no one had made the connection between the two attacks, which were separated by both time and geography. The first sign of significant acceleration in these attacks came in 1984. In May of that year, Bernice Courtemanche, a 17-year-old high school student, vanished after being last seen by her boyfriend's mother in Claremont, New Hampshire. The killings intensified dramatically in the mid-'80s, forcing investigators to confront the shocking truth. A serial predator was operating with impunity in their rural communities. The definitive realization began with the discovery of clustered remains, demonstrating a clear pattern in victim disposal. In 1985 and 1986, the skeletal remains of 2 different victims were recovered, chillingly, within only 1,000 feet of each other in a wooded area near Kellyville, New Hampshire. Forensic examination confirmed both women had died from multiple stab wounds, definitively linking them to the violent modus operandi established in the earlier cases. The proximity of the dump sites strongly implied the predator had a fixed zone of operation and felt secure using these remote spots repeatedly. His boldness peaked during this period, signaling an escalation in his compulsion. Between the recovery of those 2 bodies, the pattern drastically changed when a 36-year-old woman in Saxons River, Vermont, was fatally stabbed inside her own home. This high-risk aggression, a substantial leap from opportunistic roadside abduction, signified a major psychological shift for the perpetrator. Home invasions carry a much higher risk of forensic evidence being left behind and also entail a much greater risk to the predator. This suggests that his compulsion had overridden his fear of capture or his self-preservation instincts, and he could no longer wait for an opportunistic encounter. Just 10 days after this highly aggressive Vermont attack, the remains of yet another missing woman were found, again showing the clear evidence of stab wounds. The rapid succession and consistent method of death provided undeniable proof to investigators that they were dealing with a single active serial offender. Without a named perpetrator, investigators notably had to rely on the expertise of criminal profilers to figure out what sort of deranged dude they were chasing. The resulting profile suggests a predator who was intensely angry and utilized control through physical domination, culminating in extreme violence. This anger and loss of control in his personal life seemed to be the engine of the entire spree, according to the profilers. Profilers suggest that this sick puppy enjoyed the quote-unquote emotional release from the extended act of stabbing. Further, his choice of a knife rather than a gun indicated that he truly wanted to revel in the up-close and personal prolonged nature of the act. They even suggested that this was an alternative form of a quote-unquote release for this predator, if you catch my drift. The entire pattern of violence abruptly ceased in August 1988 after the attacker encountered 30-year-old Jane Borowski. Borowski, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, survived 27 stab wounds. Her escape was pivotal. The attack stopped, suggesting her survival terrified the perpetrator. For a killer who had operated with total anonymity for a decade, the existence of a living eyewitness capable of generating a clear composite sketch represented an existential threat. Crucially, Borowski's detailed memory enabled the creation of a composite sketch, giving law enforcement the first and only visual image of the man who tormented the region. Around 2006, a prominent theory emerged linking the attacks to Michael Nicolou, a man who had died in 2005 after slaying his wife and stepdaughter. This was largely based on his history of violence and his geographical proximity to the attacks, but there was immediately a problem with this hypothesis. Jane Borowski, the sole survivor, has publicly stated in interviews that, after reviewing the evidence and considering the terrifying details of her encounter, she doesn't believe it was him. Her denial, based on the intimate knowledge of the attacker's appearance and demeanor during the life-and-death struggle, effectively halts the closure offered by this theory. At present, the cases of all the women remain unsolved, with some believing that the earlier attacks and the home invasion may not be part of the same cluster of slayings. In 1127, the people of Peterborough in England were shaken by a terrifying spectacle. It was said that a phantasmal hunting party rampaged through the woods repeatedly. These otherworldly huntsmen rode on black horses, and even black goats, accompanied by a pack of jet-black hounds with eyes like saucers. The spectral horde blew horns and shouted in the night, striking fear into all who heard them. This eerie scene is a classic example of the wild hunt, a ghostly chase that has haunted European folklore for millennia. The wild hunt is a widespread folklore motif involving a supernatural hunting party in furious pursuit, usually seen riding across the sky or through remote forests during stormy nights. The hunters are ghostly apparitions, often the souls of the dead or other supernatural beings like phantom warriors and demon dogs. Leading this unruly band is a wild huntsman, a mythic or ghostly figure whose identity varies by region. In Germanic lands, the leader was frequently identified as the god Odin or another pagan deity. Elsewhere, the huntsman might be a cursed legendary hero, a biblical villain such as Herod or Cain, or even the devil himself leading his legions. Regardless of the leader's name, the wild hunt's appearance is invariably fearsome. A clamoring cavalcade rushing by with black horses, spectral riders, and baying hounds. Encountering it was believed to be an exceedingly bad omen. Witnesses feared it heralded a looming war or plague, or at worst, their own imminent death. Many stories warn that anyone who crosses the wild hunt's path risks being swept up into the ride. The unlucky soul might be abducted to the land of the dead or, in Celtic regions, to fairy realms, never to return. Folklorists have traced wild hunt stories across northern, western, and central Europe and amongst Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic peoples. It's generally believed to originate from Germanic myths and legend, diffusing out from them to these other groups, though this isn't known with complete certainty. The concept is also found in areas that were once heavily influenced by these groups, including northern Italy, France, and Spain. The term wild hunt, known in German as wilde Jagd, was coined by the legendary folklorist Jacob Grimm in 1835. He had studied various folk tales of spectral hunters and hypothesized ancient pagan origins for the myth. Modern scholars debate the particulars of those origins, but the legend of the wild host on night rides struck a chord in many cultures. From Scandinavia to Spain, each region told its own version of the wild hunt, adapting the core motif to local characters and beliefs. Despite the varied geographical locations, every version of the wild hunt carries an aura of doom. In medieval times, a community that claimed to witness a spectral hunting party in the sky might fear that disaster was imminent. To see the wild hunt at all was to risk one's life or soul. Many stories tell of the hunters snatching up lone travelers, or anyone foolish enough to get in their way. More often than not, the wild hunt also served as a warning, often coming as a punishment for wrongdoing. Thus, the frightening myth reminded people to live rightly and humbly, lest they join that ghostly troop after death. Some folklorists and skeptics argue that reported wild hunt sightings could stem from natural atmospheric or environmental phenomena. One suggestion is that people witnessing powerful winter storms might interpret these as spectral riders, thunderous horses, and hellhounds racing across the skies. Historically, turbulent weather under dark winter skies would have been fertile ground for such misperceptions. Another hypothesis draws on psychological and social cultural factors. According to this view, collective anxiety could lead to shared hallucinations or group-reinforced legends. When combined with oral tradition and expectation, even ordinary sounds could be interpreted as evidence of these ghostly hunts. Still another claim is that this represents a sighting of an aurora borealis, or reflects the distant and ancient cultural memories of sightings of them. Of course, the traditional view that these are actually rare ghostly riders in the sky continues to remain popular as well. On the afternoon of November 26, 2025, a massive fire broke out in the Wang Fuk Court housing complex in Hong Kong's Tai Po district. The blaze rapidly escalated into a catastrophe, engulfing 7 of the complex's 8 high-rise towers and burning for over 40 hours. By early December, authorities confirmed at least 160 people had been killed, including 1 firefighter, and 79 injured, with several residents still unaccounted for. The sheer scale of destruction at Wang Fuk Court shocked the city and the world. Hong Kong, known for its dense urban landscape, had not seen such a deadly fire since 1948. The estate's close to 5,000 residents, many of them elderly, watched their community transformed into an inferno. At present, the true cause of this catastrophic fire which shocked the world is still being investigated. Investigations soon revealed that Wang Fuk Court had been a tinderbox in the making due to ongoing renovation work. All 8 residential towers, built in the 1980s under a government housing program, were covered in bamboo scaffolding at the time of the fire. The scaffolding was draped in green protective netting and plastic as workers carried out major exterior repairs. Critically, polystyrene foam boards had been placed over windows across the buildings to shield units from falling debris during construction. These foam panels, essentially slabs of styrofoam, would later act as potent fuel for the fire. In effect, the entire complex was wrapped in flammable material from top to bottom, a dangerous setup that experts say can turn a single spark into a sweeping blaze. The decision to use bamboo scaffolding and netting is common in Hong Kong, but it carries risks if proper safety measures aren't followed. Bamboo itself is a natural combustible material, though professionals note it's not as easily ignited as one might think, especially when proper fire netting is used. In this case, however, initial reports indicate some of the netting didn't meet fire safety standards. Using cheaper mesh netting can save costs, and investigators suspect substandard nets were used as a cost-cutting measure despite guidelines advising otherwise. Some have even speculated that the netting itself may have been flammable, literally adding an extra layer of fuel to the fire. Exactly how the Wangfuk Court fire started remains under investigation, but early reports and eyewitness accounts provide some clues. The blaze is believed to have ignited on the lower floors of Block F, one of the middle towers in the estate. Around 2:45 in the afternoon, residents noticed smoke and small flames near that building's exterior, and within minutes the bamboo scaffolding and netting were ablaze. Fueled by the dry mesh and the foam boards, the fire raced vertically up Block F, and then leapt laterally to adjacent blocks by embers and collapsing scaffolding. By the time firefighters arrived roughly 10 minutes after the first alarm, the blaze had already engulfed multiple floors and was rapidly extending to other towers. While the precise ignition source is yet to be confirmed, one theory emerged from viral video footage: a construction worker's discarded cigarette. In the days after the disaster, a clip circulated on social media showing workers smoking on the scaffold shortly before the fire erupted. If you're one of those people who just listens, I've included one of these videos, which allegedly shows a worker on the tower smoking right before the fire started. I note that the authenticity of this video hasn't been independently verified, but this raised suspicions that a smoldering cigarette butt could have easily set the dry netting alight. Notably, what is confirmed is that residents had long complained about workers smoking and flicking lit butts around the site during the renovation. It's entirely plausible that a single careless ember found its way to the flammable netting and triggered the initial blaze. What is certain is that once the fire started, the improper materials on the building ensured it spread at explosive speed. A government official later confirmed that substandard debris nets and foam panels were the main culprits in allowing the fire to engulf 7 buildings. Notably, some early official comments had blamed bamboo scaffolding itself, calling for a switch to metal scaffolds, but so-called experts pushed back against making bamboo the scapegoat. Honestly, though, I have my doubts about this, since encircling a building in a flammable wood seems to be an invitation for trouble. Compounding the situation, the fire struck during a period of unusually dry and windy weather. The city was under what they called a red fire danger warning due to low humidity and strong monsoon winds that week. These conditions helped any spark turn into a blaze and fanned the flames as they climbed the scaffold. As investigators delved into the tragedy, a pattern of safety lapses and ignored warnings began to emerge. One of the most alarming revelations was that none of the fire alarm systems in the complex functioned during the emergency. Residents reported breaking glass alarm pull stations and frantically pressing buttons to trigger alarms, only to find silence. It was later determined that the fire alarm panels in all 8 towers had been inactive, allegedly turned off during construction. In fact, a former security guard had blown the whistle on this months earlier and was fired for his trouble. This apparent negligence meant precious minutes were lost before residents became aware of the fire, a tragedy that was compounded given that so many residents were elderly and infirm. Other basic fire safety measures had also been compromised during the project. Some exit stairwell windows had been oddly boarded up with wood. This was an unofficial quote-unquote modification, apparently done for the workers' convenience that also clearly undermined fire safety. This very odd fact has led to some sinister theories about the fire, though at present there's nothing to suggest anything beyond negligence and extreme greed. And speaking of extreme greed, I'm going to get to that in a moment, because this is what happens when companies put profit before anything else. Disturbingly, in late 2024, long before the fire, tenants and owners grew concerned about the very hazards that caused the blaze. The estate's homeowners committee had hired a consulting firm, Will Power Architects, to oversee the renovation process. The architects recommended a firm called Prestige Construction and Engineering, which later became the project contractor. They assured residents that the company had a spotless safety record and had been compliant with all laws and regulations. In reality, Prestige had been cited and fined numerous times in prior years for safety violations, including unsafe scaffolding practices and faulty electrical work. Disturbingly, this history was not disclosed to the residents at the time. Once word leaked out that Prestige actually had a checkered record, many in the complex were outraged well before the fire. Homeowners protested the contractor's appointment, alleging bid rigging and corruption in the selection process. Perhaps most disturbingly of all, Hong Kong's deputy leader revealed that Prestige mixed compliant fire-resistant mesh with substandard mesh to fool safety inspections. By early December, at least 15 people associated with the renovation project had been taken into custody on suspicion of offenses ranging from negligent manslaughter to corruption. At the same time, there are significant calls for transparency and an independent inquiry into the tragedy. Under this pressure, Hong Kong's chief executive has promised to impanel a group of judges with wide-ranging powers to investigate the true causes of this horrific tragedy. Patricia Campbell was a 15-year-old girl from Pocatello, Idaho, who vanished on July 22, 1978, during a Community Pioneer Day celebration at Alameda Park. She was last seen with her friend, 12-year-old Tina Anderson, enjoying the festivities that summer evening. When Tina failed to show up for a scheduled babysitting job across from the park that night, the girls' families reported them missing. Initially, authorities treated the girls as possible runaways, a common assumption at the time, but this theory would soon collapse as evidence of foul play emerged. 3 years later, in October 1981, hunters stumbled upon human remains in a remote, brushy hillside area about 60 miles from Pocatello in rural Oneida County. Investigators arriving on the scene discovered scattered bones and a skull with a small hole in it. They also discovered deteriorated clothing matching what Patricia and Tina had been wearing when they disappeared. Spent shell casings were also recovered at the site, a grim indication of their violent end. The remains were identified as belonging to 2 young females, and one set was positively identified through dental records as Tina Anderson. The other bones were strongly suspected to be Patricia Campbell's, given that both girls had disappeared together. But at the time, in 1981, there was not enough evidence to conclusively identify Patricia's remains. The then technically unidentified victim, later confirmed to be Patricia, also showed signs of severe blunt force trauma to the head. The discovery of the bodies definitively ended any speculation that the girls were runaways. The case of Patricia Campbell and Tina Anderson presented immediate challenges to the authorities. Perhaps most obviously, the initial assumption that they were runaways may have resulted in significant evidence being forever lost to time. And stay tuned, because it'll become apparent shortly that the initial investigation was extremely questionable, even according to the authorities themselves. Because the remains were found in Oneida County, outside of Pocatello's jurisdiction, multiple law enforcement agencies became involved. Investigators back in 1978 had few solid leads. However, through interviews, they learned the 2 girls had left Alameda Park at one point on July 22nd with some acquaintances. According to witness reports later uncovered, Patricia and Tina, along with a few other local youths, visited a nearby house during the festival. From there, they then rode in a pickup truck with several adults to an area known as Moonlight Mine Road, a popular party spot for teens at the time. Those adults told police they had driven the girls back to the park after the outing, and neither girl was seen again after that. These circumstances suggest the girls perhaps initially willingly accompanied people they thought they knew, rather than being abducted by a stranger off the street. This would become a key point in the investigation, steering some investigators to suspect someone in the girls' social circle rather than an unknown predator. Despite those early leads, no arrests were made in the initial years. Years later, the investigation gained new momentum, and the scarcity of initial investigative materials was noted. In 2002, Oneida County Sheriff's Deputy Patsy Sherman took it upon herself to re-examine the cold case. She was shocked to find that the entire case file was made up of a large envelope and some physical evidence that had been preserved. Sherman spent years coordinating with multiple agencies and tracking down old witnesses, gradually expanding the case file. A major break came in 2007 when a joint task force of officers from 5 agencies and 3 counties was formed to excavate and reinvestigate the crime scene. In May 2007, detectives returned to the rural canyon where the remains had been found and unearthed a key piece of evidence that had been missed. They didn't publicly reveal what this item was, but investigators described it as directly linked to a suspect that hadn't been publicly named. Around the same time, an Idaho prison inmate provided new information about possible suspects, further energizing the inquiry. However, again, it's unclear what specific evidence came from this, and if that evidence has been able to further these cases. Another crucial development in 2007 was in forensic identification. Investigators realized that confirming the identity of the second body was vital. The Oneida County Sheriff's Office located Patricia's presumed remains, which had been misplaced in evidence storage for years, and submitted them for DNA testing. In March 2007, nearly 29 years after Patricia had gone missing, modern DNA analysis finally confirmed that those remains were Patricia Campbell's, as was long believed. In a parallel twist, additional remains had been found in the area years after the initial discovery. In October 1986, a hunter found a partial human skull in the same 2-mile canyon area of Oneida County. At the time, forensic experts were unsure if this skull was related to Patricia and Tina's case. Early anthropological analysis of the skull suggested an adolescent female of around 16 years old. Crucially, this anthropologist identified the remains as being from someone of likely mixed racial ancestry, which didn't match with Patricia. As a result, Patricia was considered and then ruled out as the identity of the skull back in the 1980s. Investigators believed it might belong to a third unidentified victim, colloquially dubbed the Oneida County Jane Doe. Unfortunately, this skull too was mishandled. It was sent for testing and then lost in transit between labs and evidence rooms, remaining missing for decades. It finally resurfaced in 2018, giving detectives another chance to identify the skull. But I'll come back to this in a moment. By 2016, authorities felt they were closing in on the culprits. The Oneida County Sheriff's Office announced publicly that year that the case was essentially solved, at least in theory. Investigators were confident they knew who the perpetrators were, the motive, and how the slayings occurred. However, this announcement came with a major caveat. Some key physical evidence had been lost over time, leaving their case strong, but largely circumstantial. In 2017, Oneida County's prosecutor announced that due to the lack of available evidence needed for trial, he was handing the case back to investigators for further work. He noted that certain evidence had deteriorated or disappeared, making it impossible to meet the burden of proof in court. By way of reminder, and why this is so important, the prosecution, as a general rule, only has one shot on a charge, so they need to come prepared with their best possible evidence. Still, this was a frustrating setback, even though law enforcement believed they had identified more than one suspect responsible for the disturbing acts. A major breakthrough in the forensic side of the case came in recent years. With the skull from 1986 back in hand as of 2018, the Sheriff's Office partnered with advanced DNA specialists to finally put the Oneida Jane Doe question to rest. In 2021, the Sheriff's Office teamed up with Othram, a private laboratory specializing in forensic genealogy, to attempt to identify the skull using cutting-edge techniques. Othram scientists successfully extracted DNA from the degraded skull fragments and performed forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive genetic profile. This proprietary method was used to create a genealogical profile and match this Jane Doe to Patricia Campbell. Importantly for the investigation, this reshaped the narrative of the case by clarifying that there weren't more victims in that canyon. Over the years, investigators and local residents have formulated several theories about who was responsible for the slayings of Patricia Campbell and Tina Anderson, and why. Between 1978 and 1983, at least 4 teenage girls in the region were abducted and slain under mysterious circumstances. All were students around the same age, many from the same school, and all vanished in or near Pocatello. It's been speculated that given the fact that this is an area with a small population, the odds of these cases being unrelated is infinitesimal. Early on, Ted Bundy was even speculated to have been involved in the slayings of these 2 girls, but Bundy was confirmed to be elsewhere by 1978. More likely, any serial involvement would point to a local culprit or culprits operating in southeastern Idaho in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Speculation has long focused on the adults who were last seen with Patricia Campbell and Tina Anderson. To address the elephant in the room, the very idea that these fully grown adults were taking these 2 girls to a quote-unquote party spot has obviously set off alarm bells. It's long been speculated that they may have also been providing them with substances as well. Independent witnesses confirmed the girls willingly accompanied these individuals in a pickup truck to Moonlight Mine Road, a popular hangout for teens. Although the adults insisted they'd return the girls safely to Alameda Park, neither Patricia nor Tina was seen again afterward, casting doubt on their account. With circumstantial evidence pointing toward familiarity rather than random abduction, these adults are believed by many to be those who are still under scrutiny by the authorities. At present, it's unclear if any potential DNA evidence of the perpetrator or perpetrators has been found or preserved. If it has, given the ability to recover significantly degraded DNA, and given the power of genetic genealogy, those responsible for these heinous acts shouldn't rest too easy.